I found the original partnership agreement my son thought he'd destroyed, stuffed inside the spare tire well of that classic 1973 VW bus. And that single piece of paper is the reason he now grinds coffee beans wearing a shirt that says "Grounds for Divorce," while every cup we serve prints his fraud case number. My name is Ellie, and this is the story of how I turned a $380,000 betrayal into the most poetic revenge I could have ever imagined. My husband Frank died 2 years ago from pancreatic cancer, leaving me that old Type 2 bus as his final love letter. Frank taught high school shop class for 31 years, the kind of teacher who kept a jar of extra lug nuts on his desk and never let a kid fail if they showed up willing to learn. On weekends, he rebuilt engines in our garage, and that bus had been rusting in the corner for a decade, an unfinished project he'd bought for $1,100 at an estate sale. The paint was the color of faded mustard, the canvas sunroof was dry rotted, and the motor was a seized 1.6-liter air-cooled block that hadn't turned over since 1991. He kept saying, "Ellie, when I retire, you and I are taking this thing to every national park west of the Mississippi." He never got to retire. After the funeral, I sat in that driver's seat for 3 hours, gripping a steering wheel that smelled like his hand cleaner and sawdust, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. In the glove box, I found a spiral notebook filled with sketches. He'd drawn a floor plan for a mobile espresso bar long before I ever considered it. A fold-down service window, a compact water tank under the rear bench, a diagram of a manual espresso machine labeled Ellie's Station. On the last page, he wrote, "Cash out the Lake House CD and give this bus a purpose. You're the best librarian I ever knew, and libraries aren't just books, they're the ritual of being human together. Let this bus be your new shelf of stories." So at 52, I walked into our credit union and liquidated a $115,000 certificate of deposit we'd been nurturing since our wedding anniversary in 1997. Every cent went into a legitimate business conversion. A full rust remediation and chassis reinforcement by a specialty shop in Nevada, a commercial-grade La Marzocco GS3 with a paddle group head, a reverse osmosis water filtration system, an under-counter refrigerator, custom walnut counters, and shelving milled by a retired cabite maker named Gus, and a vehicle wrap printed in a design that made the bus look like a traveling Italian paesa, complete with Trompe l'oeil brickwork and an awning over the sliding window. I registered the business as a 50-50 partnership with my only son, Derek. He was 33, charming in a way that filled rooms but never lasted, with a degree in marketing and a resume of brand consulting that mostly meant he'd been fired from 3 agencies and was now selling social media audits to local restaurants. He came to me with a typed proposal, a profit-sharing spreadsheet, and a schedule that promised he'd manage pop-up bookings, health permits, and online engagement, while I would be the face behind the window on weekends, making lattes and talking to people. I was the one who insisted on a formal partnership agreement. I paid a small-town lawyer $450 to draft it, and we signed in the presence of 2 neighbors, Martha and Jim from across the street, who witnessed and dated each page. I trusted Derek completely. He was my child, and Frank had loved him despite his drifting. That detail, the witnessed and notarized agreement stuffed into the spare tire well, would later become the fulcrum for everything that followed. The betrayal started with the kind of success that breeds greed. 6 months after we launched, the bus stop espresso, our little coffee bus was featured on a local morning show's Hidden Gems segment. They showed me pulling a perfect Rosetta on a flat white while Frank's old bus idled in the background of a farmer's market, and within 24 hours, Derek's phone was ringing off the hook. A regional chain called High Grounds Coffee, 9 locations across the Pacific Northwest, contacted him directly. They were building a heritage sub-brand and wanted our authentic aesthetic, our custom syrup recipes, our roasted bean supplier relationships, and the entire online following Derek had built. I told him I wasn't interested in selling. The bus was Frank's legacy, and I had no desire to hand my recipes to a corporation that would reduce them to automated batch brew. Derek hugged me and said, "Mom, of course not. That's our baby." "I'm just listening." But I later learned he'd been negotiating for 2 weeks. On a Monday morning, I drove to the secured lot where we kept the bus under a weatherproof canopy, and the space was empty. I called Derek. No answer. I called again, 8 times in an hour. I had hidden a small GPS tile under the passenger side cup holder, a trick I'd learned from a library patron who tracked his stolen book cart. I opened the Find My app and watched the bus's location pulse at a corporate lot 30 miles away, an address that matched High Ground's headquarters. When I finally reached Derek, his voice was smooth and slow, like he was reading from a script. "Mom, calm down. I moved it for a private event. I'll bring it back tomorrow." 3 days later, he walked into my kitchen without knocking, wearing a linen blazer that looked brand new, and he slid a white envelope across my kitchen table. "Here's a little something for your trouble. I took care of everything." Inside were 40 $100 bills folded neatly, the kind of cash a drugstore clerk might hand you as change for a check. $4,000. A tip, he then explained, with the detachment of a waiter reciting specials, that he'd sold the bus, the brand, the recipe book, and our entire online presence to High Grounds Coffee for $380,000. He said he'd reviewed our incorporation documents and determined that because he had originated the concept and managed the operational execution, I was legally a silent investor, essentially an employee. He owned the rights. Then he left, and an hour later, his wife Megan texted me a photo of a brand new Tesla Model Y with a license plate frame that read "Grateful." I did not scream. I did not call the police, not yet. I sat for a full hour at that kitchen table, staring at the garage wall, feeling a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. And then I started cleaning, because Frank used to say that when a machine breaks, you don't yell at it. You take it apart piece by piece until you find the fault. I went to the corner of the garage where I'd stored a plastic bin of spare parts and old manuals I'd pulled from the bus before Derek had it towed for detailing. He told me to toss that bin into the garbage, calling it vintage junk that smells like oil. I never listened. The bin was heavy with distributor caps, carburetor gaskets, and a set of original mud flaps. Beside it stood the spare tire, a dry, rotted bias ply that hadn't held air since the Reagan administration. I lifted it with both hands, the rubber cracking like old leather, and there, wedged between the wheel well liner and the steel pan, I saw a manila envelope caked in 30 years of grease and garage dust. The outside was stamped in blue ballpoint. "Vehicle title documents, original, do not discard." My hands steadied in a way that surprised me. I opened the flap and slid out the contents. Inside were the original title transfer from the private seller we bought the shell from, a yellowed bill of sale showing my name and Frank's name as joint buyers, a carbon copy of our first registration, and the original 50-50 partnership agreement I had paid a lawyer to draft. Every page was there, the blue ink of Derek's signature slightly raised on the paper, the notary stamp crisp and legible with a valid commission number. But as I flipped to the last page, I froze. At the bottom, in Frank's handwriting, a note he must have tucked inside before he died, a note he wrote in the final weeks when the cancer had hollowed him, but his mind remained sharp. "Ellie, if you ever find this, remember that a man who can charm you in a crisis is the most dangerous type. Trust the numbers, not the smile. The bus is yours, not his. Never sign anything without a witness you pay, not a relative." I held that paper and cried for the second time that day, but these tears were different. They were steady and clarifying, the kind of tears that coat a decision in a hard lacquer of resolve. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family can be the worst kind of fraud. Now, let me tell you exactly how I exposed him. An hour after I found that envelope, Derek and Megan showed up at my front door together, a coordinated tactic that I now recognize as the classic predator's double back. He wore a seersucker blazer and carried a leather portfolio that smelled new. Megan hovered behind him in a linen dress that probably cost $800, holding her phone at arm's reach to photograph my flower bed for her interior design Instagram account, which had 30,000 followers and not a single original thought. Derek sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd handed me the $4,000, and told me he'd been deeply concerned about my emotional state. He said, "Mom, you're not yourself. You've been foggy, you've been forgetting things, and frankly, we're worried about your safety living alone." He then produced a packet of papers, a release of all claims and indemnification agreement that he explained would protect me from any liability related to the bus's sale. If I signed, he'd set up a small trust in my name that would pay out a modest monthly allowance. I read the first page while pretending to dab my eyes with a tissue. The document was 12 pages long, dense with legal boilerplate, and buried in Section 8 was a clause that assigned my future intellectual property rights to a holding company I'd never heard of, a shell entity with a P.O. box in Delaware. Megan leaned in, blinking with the performative innocence of someone who'd practiced this expression in a mirror, and said, "We're doing this for you, Ellie. This is all so stressful, and we just want you to be comfortable." I realized then that the only way to uncover the full scope of what they'd done was to appear weak. I pressed a crumpled tissue to my eyes and let my voice quiver. "I'm just so foggy," I said. "I don't know what to do anymore. Maybe you're right. Let me think about it for a few days." They left the papers on the table. I did not sign them. 2 days later, I packed a small overnight bag, the kind I used to carry for library conferences, and I moved into their spare bedroom under the pretense of accepting their care. That house was a monument to Megan's curated fantasy, a 5-bedroom colonial revival on a cul-de-sac that they'd bought 2 years earlier with an adjustable-rate mortgage. The walls were gallery white, the furniture was clear acrylic and stainless steel, and every surface held a stack of coffee table books arranged by color gradient. But the foundation was cracking in ways you couldn't see from Instagram. The first night, at 11:30, I heard Derek in his home office, a converted walk-in closet off the primary suite, screaming into his phone. I crept into the hallway and pressed my ear against the drywall next to the doorframe, where the sound carried cleanly through the hollow core. He was talking to someone named Aaron, and the conversation was a frantic patching of leaks. "Look, my mom's signature is on the original transfer documents, okay? I'll get a wet signature on the new forms by Friday. The notary is scheduled. Just tell the escrow officer to release the second installment." A wet signature. He needed a live, witnessed signature on some updated documentation, likely a promissory note or a title affidavit that would retroactively legitimize the forged transfer he'd already filed. I stood in that hallway, barefoot on the engineered hardwood, and I made a mental inventory of what I'd just heard. The second installment. That meant the $380,000 payment was structured in stages, contingent on Derek delivering clean chain of title and intellectual property assignments. If he failed, the money would be frozen, and High Grounds would claw back what they'd already advanced. I understood then that Derek was drowning in a scheme of his own making, and he needed me to either sign my life away or disappear. Over the next week, I observed their finances with the methodical patience of a forensic accountant. I paid attention to things most people ignore. The Tesla was leased, not purchased, with a 36-month term and a mileage cap that Megan constantly exceeded driving to boutiques 60 miles away. They ate every meal through DoorDash because Megan couldn't make a piece of toast without triggering the photoelectric smoke alarm, which she'd had professionally removed rather than learned to cook. I counted 12 delivery boxes from high-end retailers over a single weekend, each one a small loan against a future income stream that hadn't yet materialized. One morning, while Derek was in the shower, I glanced at a stack of mail on the kitchen island. It included a final notice from a credit card company with a balance of $28,000, a past due invoice from a marina for a boat slip they'd leased for a pontoon boat they didn't yet own, and a statement from a luxury travel agency booking a 10-day Adriatic coast concierge experience that cost more than my first car. He had spent money he did not possess, leveraging the anticipated High Grounds payout, and the payout was imperiled because the title he'd promised to deliver was fraudulent. On my 4th morning there, I engineered what looked like an accident. I brewed a full 12-cup carafe of dark roast in their French press, and as Megan approached the kitchen island with her iPad to edit a reel of her minimalist morning routine, I deliberately caught my foot on the edge of the area rug and spilled the entire carafe of near-boiling coffee across the white quartz countertop. It cascaded into drawers, soaked a stack of mail, and puddled on the floor. Megan shrieked in a pitch that could have shattered wine glasses. "Oh my God, Ellie, do you know how much that quartz costs? It's porous. It's going to stain Derek. While she flapped her hands and stared at the mess like it was a biohazard, I played flustered and apologetic. I grabbed a roll of paper towels and said, "I'm so sorry, I'll clean it up. Do you have any baking soda? That draws out coffee stains." She ignored me and ran upstairs. Derek appeared in the doorway, still toweling his hair, and he looked at the flooded counter with the exhausted disgust of a man who had far bigger problems. I seized the moment. "Derek, I need to call my insurance agent about my homeowner's policy, but I left the contact info at home. Do you have a filing cabinet where I could look up a number? It might be with the paperwork I gave you when I moved in." He was too annoyed to be suspicious. He pointed toward the garage and said, "There's a cabinet in the corner, keys under the fake succulent. Just don't touch anything else." The garage was a chaotic contrast to the curated home. Boxes of holiday decorations, a Peloton bike still in its shipping wrap, stacks of old financial records. The filing cabinet was a cheap 2-drawer unit with a wafer lock, the kind you can buy at an office supply store for $40. I had spent my decades as a librarian not only with books but with institutional security. In small libraries, you learn to open locked cabinets, clear jammed microfiche readers, and bypass old file room locks when keys go missing. I knelt in front of that cabinet and removed a bobby pin from my hair and a metal cuticle pusher from the toiletry kit in my bag. 5 seconds to bend the bobby pin into a tension wrench, 10 seconds to rake the tumblers with the cuticle pusher tip. The lock turned with a soft click. Inside, I found a hanging folder labeled High Grounds Acquisition. It contained the original sale agreement between Derek and High Grounds, a 26-page document outlining the purchase of all tangible and intangible assets, including the bus VIN, the trademark name, the recipe compendium, and the social media accounts. It also contained a photocopy of the title transfer application that Derek had filed with the DMV. The signature on that form was a clumsy tracing of my own, the loop of the E, in Ellie, slightly elongated, the angle of the lowercase L pressed too hard. Next to it was a promissory note in my name, guaranteeing a $200,000 loan from a regional equipment leasing company, secured against the bus's future revenue. My signature appeared again, forged with the same heavy hand. I photographed every page with my phone, taking care to capture the notary stamp. The notary's commission number was 84,712, and when I zoomed in on the photo later, I noticed the stamp's printed name belonged to a woman with a distinct middle initial. I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, locked the cabinet, and returned the key. That night, I sat in the spare bedroom and called the county recorder's office from my cell phone, speaking quietly. I asked for a title history report on the bus VIN, providing the number from memory. The clerk confirmed that the current title on file had been transferred to High Grounds Coffee, LLC, based on a release document that listed Derek as sole owner. I then called the Notary Commission Division of the Secretary of State's office and read out the notary's commission number. After a brief hold, the representative returned with a flat voice. "Ma'am, that commission number belonged to a Carol Jean Haskins, who was commissioned in 2003 and passed away 3 years ago. Her stamp should have been surrendered to the county upon her death. Any document bearing that stamp after her date of death is fraudulent. Derek had scanned an old stamp from a legitimate document and photoshopped the date. The promissory note in my name was a felony. The next step required an ally who understood the machinery of consequence. The following morning, I told Derek I was going to a grief support group and drove instead to the local branch of the credit union, where Frank and I had held our original certificate of deposit. I asked to speak with a compliance officer, and after a short wait, a calm woman named Roberta Escalante ushered me into a glass-walled office. She was about my age, wearing a navy blazer and reading glasses on a chain, and she listened without interruption while I laid out the evidence. I showed her the photographs of the forged documents, the deceased notary's commission number, and the original partnership agreement with the legitimate notarization. Roberta's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something urgent. She said, "Ellie, this is beyond an internal dispute. If a notary's identity was used posthumously on a 6-figure loan, that's wire fraud under Title 18, and it crosses state lines because the lender is incorporated in Nevada. I'm obligated to escalate this to our federal liaison." Within 48 hours, I was on a secure video call with an agent from the FBI's White-Collar Crimes Division, a man named Agent Cormier who had a tired voice and a careful way of taking notes. He explained that High Grounds Coffee had already filed an internal complaint because Derek had missed a documentation deadline, and the escrow company had frozen the remaining $260,000 of the sale proceeds. The bank that originated the promissory note had flagged the notary discrepancy and was preparing its own inquiry. Agent Cormier said, "We have enough for an investigation, but to secure an intent conviction, we need him to utter the forged document in a recorded setting. That means we need a consensual recording of him asking you to sign something you know is false, ideally in front of a third party who can corroborate." He asked if I was willing to wear a wire. I said yes without hesitation. Cormier arranged for a local detective to meet me in the parking lot of a diner 3 days later. They handed me a small device, a body-worn microphone and transmitter concealed inside the hollow of a paperback book cover, a technique I recognized from a true crime podcast. I practiced with it in my rental car until I could sew the transmitter into the lining of a cardigan without shorting the wire. I returned to Derek's house and continued to play my role with the precision of a barista calibrating a shot. Friendly, vague, emotionally pliable. I let him believe the fog was settling deeper. I mentioned I'd been thinking about signing the release papers just to make things easier. His eyes brightened like a slot machine lighting up. But before the confrontation could be set, I needed to confirm something for my own soul. I needed to know if any filament of family loyalty remained in that household, so I staged a test. One afternoon, while Derek was on a phone call in his office and Megan was in the living room editing a reel on her phone, I positioned myself in the upstairs hallway directly between the office and the stairs. I waited until I heard Derek's door open and footsteps approaching. I clutched my chest with my left hand, let out a soft gasp, and collapsed sideways onto the hallway floor, the way I'd seen a colleague faint during a school assembly in 1995. I let my body fall heavily, my head landing near the baseboard, my eyes half open, my breathing deliberately shallow and irregular. I lay there motionless, a 60-year-old woman apparently in cardiac distress. Derek's office door swung fully open. He stepped into the hallway and kept walking. His right foot came within 2 inches of my outstretched hand, and he lifted it slightly to avoid tripping, as if I were a throw rug that had bunched up. He muttered, "For God's sake," and continued past me toward the stairs where he shouted down to Megan, "Is the high grounds binder on the kitchen counter? I need the amended signature page." He did not pause. He did not check my pulse, did not call my name, did not shout for help. Megan appeared at the bottom of the stairs a few seconds later, looked up, and saw me lying on the hallway floor. She said, in a voice that carried the faintest flicker of genuine concern, "Derek, is she okay?" Without turning around, he called back, "She's just being dramatic. I'm dealing with a legal deposition deadline. I don't have time for this." Megan stared at me for another 3 seconds, her perfectly filled lips parting slightly. Then she turned and followed Derek toward the kitchen. I lay there for another full minute, counting the seconds like a metronome. The last filament of maternal hope that had somehow survived everything else burned out in that silence. When I finally stood up, I felt lighter, purged. Frank's note had warned me, but I had needed to see it with my own eyes. Now I was ready. The confrontation arrived 4 days later. Derek told me we were driving to the High Grounds corporate headquarters to finalize the paperwork that would secure my future. He explained it as a routine closing, just a few signatures, and then everything would be settled. I agreed calmly and asked if I could bring my own pen, a blue ink fountain pen Frank had given me for our 20th anniversary. Derek said that was fine. I wore the cardigan with the wire sewn into the lining, the microphone positioned inside the third buttonhole from the top, the transmitter flat against my ribs. Derek drove his leased Tesla, Megan in the backseat reapplying a shade of lip gloss called Muted Elegance, which retailed for $45 per tube. The High Grounds office was a converted warehouse in an industrial park, all exposed ductwork and reclaimed wood tables, trying very hard to look authentically rustic. We were escorted to a conference room where the general counsel, a man in his 40s named Matthew, was waiting with a stack of documents. Also present was a notary public, a contract notary hired by High Grounds, who had no idea she was about to witness a federal crime. The documents included a final assignment and release of intellectual property, a partnership dissolution and mutual indemnity agreement, and a representation of clear title. Each page had a yellow sticky tab indicating where I needed to sign. Derek slid a pen toward me, a generic ballpoint with the High Grounds logo. I ignored it. I picked up my own fountain pen, uncapped it slowly, and held it over the first signature line. The room was silent except for the hum of the HVAC. I looked at Derek, whose face was arranged in a mask of encouraging patience. I placed the pen down across the paper, aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of the page, and then folded my hands on the table. I said, in the same calm voice I'd used for 23 years when shushing a rowdy reading group, I'm not signing away my son's best chance at redemption, because he still has a lot to learn about the difference between forging a signature and earning one. Derek's expression didn't change for a full second, a lag in the processing. Then his mouth opened. "Mom, what are you doing? Just sign the papers. We talked about this." I reached into my purse and withdrew the original partnership agreement, the one from the spare tire well, its manila envelope still streaked with 30-year-old grease. I laid it next to the forged title transfer that sat in Derek's open portfolio. Even from across the table, Matthew, the general counsel, could see the mismatched signatures. I said, "This document right here, the one you told me to throw away because it was junk, was witnessed and notarized by a living notary with a valid commission. It clearly states that any transfer of assets requires both partners' written consent. The document you gave to the DMV was notarized by a dead woman named Carol Haskins, whose stamp was photoshopped from an old lease. That's wire fraud, that's identity theft, and that's a federal crime." Derek's neck flushed a deep crimson. He reached across the table and tried to grab the original agreement, his fingers clawing at the paper. But I pulled it back and Matthew stood up, chair scraping the polished concrete floor. "I'm calling our external legal team," Matthew said. "No one sign anything." At that moment, the conference room door opened, and Agent Cormier walked in, badge held at chest level in a leather case, flanked by 2 local detectives in plainclothes. He said, "Derek, we've been listening to this entire conversation through a consensual recording. You've just been witnessed uttering a forged document in the presence of a notary. I'm going to ask you to stand up slowly and place your hands behind your back." Megan let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like a deflating balloon. Derek stood, his face now blank, the charm completely drained, and for the first time in his adult life, he looked exactly like what he was, a frightened man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. The aftermath was a cascade of legal and financial consequences that unfolded over the next 8 months. Derek was arrested on multiple charges including wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and uttering a false instrument. The promissory note in my name was voided by the issuing bank within 2 weeks, and the equipment leasing company filed its own civil suit against Derek for fraudulent misrepresentation. High Grounds Coffee immediately rescinded the sale agreement, citing a material breach of warranty and the fraudulent chain of title. Because the intellectual property had been transferred through fraud, the rights reverted to me in full. The chain's reputation took a media hit, and in a surprising gesture of corporate self-preservation, High Grounds actually offered to pay me a $50,000 licensing fee to use the recipes legitimately under a clean contract. I declined. I had a better idea. I used the returned IP and a $42,000 advance from a small, independent roaster who believed in my story to launch a new business. I bought a replacement bus, a 1977 Westphalia that I found on a classified site, and I rebuilt it with the same care Frank would have given. Gus, the cabite maker, came out of retirement to replicate the walnut counters. I installed the same model La Marzocco GS3, tuned to exactly 9 bars of pressure. The vehicle wrap this time was a custom design by a local artist, a mural of a coffee plant being watered by a single tear, with the words "Brewed, Betrayal Coffee Co." in a serif font that Frank would have appreciated, and I registered the trademark. Now here's where the poetry arrives, because the universe has a sense of timing. Derek accepted a plea deal that included a suspended 60-month sentence with 5 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service, and a restitution order for the money he'd already spent from the frozen sale proceeds. The community service coordinator, after reviewing his skills and my victim impact statement, approved his redeployment to work at my coffee stand. Yes, Derek works for me now. As a condition of his restitution, he must complete 20 hours a week at Brewed Betrayal Coffee Company, grinding beans by hand with a manual burr grinder, scrubbing portafilters with a stiff brush, hauling 20-liter water jugs from the supply van, and wiping down folding tables. He wears a uniform apron over a bright yellow t-shirt that reads in bold black letters, "Grounds for divorce." That shirt is not a joke. Megan filed for divorce the day after the arrest, citing irreconcilable differences and financial abandonment, and the petition used exactly those words as a case heading. In Re the Marriage of Megan and Derek, Grounds for Divorce. The shirt is a custom order, and I print a new one every time the old one fades, which happens fast because Derek sweats a lot now. Every single cup of coffee I serve, whether it's a single origin Ethiopian Yirgacheffe pour-over or a simple drip, is handed out in a custom sleeve printed with Derek's fraud case number, a QR code that links directly to the public court docket on the county's PACER equivalent database, and the phrase, "Enjoy the bitterness." Tourists love it. They take photos of Derek holding a bag of our beans next to the bus, sometimes with the shirt visible, sometimes just the QR code on the sleeve, and they post them with captions like, "Justice is best served at 200 degrees Fahrenheit." The local newspaper did a follow-up piece, not on the crime, but on the business model, calling it the most honest coffee in the state. I keep Frank's original note framed in my new apartment, mounted on the wall next to a photograph of the old bus, the one Derek sold, the one Frank never got to ride in. It reminds me that integrity isn't something you inherit or borrow or manipulate your way into. It is something you prove every single day, usually when no one is watching, and always when it costs you something. My husband saw the truth before I did, but I'm the one who got to serve it, with a perfectly extracted double shot and a paper sleeve that tells the whole bitter story. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true accounts of family, fraud, and the long game of justice. See you in the next one.